should hope after 11 or 12 years I might have something to say. But one thing that I've learned in those 11, 12 years is that every process is very, very different, and every process is unique. And so if you're doing your job well, also constitution building assistance must be very different in the different places that you work. And so what I shall try to do today is speak about generalities that I think apply to most places that I've been. And maybe what we can do in the discussion is think about how many of these generalities, which seem to apply to many of the places where I've worked, do or do not apply in the case of Syria. And why is that? Why is Syria in some cases so different in terms of the constitution process? I was going to say, so normally I have a tendency to speak very quickly, so I was going to say to the interpreters to wave at me if I'm speaking too quickly for you, but I can't see you, so you just have to bang on the window or scream or something. All right, so I'm gonna divide my talk into three sections. The first one, what I would like to do is give a bit of a historical perspective on international influence over constitution making. And I think by doing that, what I hope to do is illustrate some of the trends which are now apparent when we look at the landscape of constitution building assistance around the world today. The second part of my talk, what I would like to do is talk about external constitution making and the politics of constitution making. And in particular, I get very annoyed when people, and this happened a lot at the UN, they see constitution making and constitutional advice as something very technical. This is for lawyers, this is something very technical. But as you know, having sat in the Constitutional Committee of Syria or worked on the WAP, it's all political. And that means that the external assistance is working in a very highly charged political environment, and we should be aware as international assistance providers of how we're affecting the domestic politics when we provide advice. So that will be the second part of the talk. And in the third part of my talk, I'm going to illustrate some principles that I think are useful guidance for providing international assistance. And I'm working on this, trying to finish it now for the UN, because when I was there, the UN is everywhere, right? So, but what they cannot do is have really strong constitutional expertise everywhere. It's just too big. And so what I found was quite a variable quality in the types of people that were providing constitutional advice from country to country. So I thought one thing that might be useful is to provide some guidance about what the do's and the don'ts of providing constitutional advice as far as I see them at the UN. But I also think that document will be useful for national stakeholders to hold their international partners to account and say, well, these are principles which we think international assistance should abide by. All right, so let me start with a bit of a historical perspective and the changing landscape of international assistance. And so I think the first thing to say is international assistance to constitution making is not new. It's always existed, as far as I know, in various forms. People have always taken ideas from other countries. When James Madison was working on the US Constitution, he would send samples of American trees and plants to Paris, where Thomas Jefferson would sell them and say, these are the kinds of things we're growing in America, would you like to buy? And in return, Thomas Jefferson would send to James Madison books about European constitutional systems. And James Madison lent a lot on learning from European constitutional history in drafting the American Constitution, including Switzerland. So international advice, that was really the first written constitution, and even there, perhaps not an international advisor, but certainly leaning on the experience of other countries was very important. International advice was already happening. Rousseau, born in Geneva, he was called upon to write constitutions for Corsica and for Poland, or Poland-Lithuania. And then over the course of the next 200 years, there was a constant back and forth of constitutional advisors around the world. When I see someone from Japan and many people from Germany, I think of two of the most famous examples, is that in the post-war years of World War II, America and their allies essentially drafted constitutions for those two countries. But also in the first written constitution of Japan in the 1880s, the Meiji Constitution, Japan established a commission, a government commission. It went around the world. It looked at different constitutional systems, and it brought back with it two German scholars to help write the first written constitution for Japan. Just to give some more examples, in India, the country of my family, B.N. Rao, who's the advisor to the assembly, set off on a ship And he went to America, he went to Russia, he went to Ireland, he went to the UK, and he came back with lots of advice from foreigners. In Ireland, Leo Kohn, a German scholar again, so Germans seem to have quite a history in terms of the history of external constitutional advice. He worked on the Irish 1937 constitution. He then took those ideas and worked on what eventually was the aborted constitution for Israel. And previous to Ireland, he was involved in the 1931 Republican Constitution for Spain before Franco took over. And if you look at those drafts, you can also see the same kinds of ideas in those drafts. And so it's clear that these people, these individuals, were responsible for what we call the migration of constitutional ideas. Thurgood Marshall, before being on the US Supreme Court, provided input into the Kenyan Constitution of 1963. Famously, the British, Welshman, I should say, having grown up in Wales, proud to associate myself with Ivor Jennings, who the British sent all over, mainly South Asia, to write constitutions for Pakistan, for Sri Lanka. Egyptian scholar Uthman Khalil Uthman worked on a constitution for Kuwait, and the list goes on. And in terms of, so constitutional advice is not new, constitutional advisors is not new, learning from other constitutional systems is not new. One thing that I think is changing is the number of constitution-making processes that we see in the world. So according to a study that was done since World War II, there's an average of 5 new constitutions every year. You know, sometimes people ask me, wait, all you do is advice on constitution making? Is there really so much constitution making in the world to keep you busy? Well, I can tell you that I was looking at my calendar, and we have this meeting on Syria, I have a meeting on Libya, I have a meeting on Armenia, I have a meeting on Belarus, and there's one more, a meeting on Chad. At IDEA, we produce an annual review of constitution building, and normally in any year, there's about 20 countries that are seeking to reform their constitutions. So if we have about 190 countries in the world, that's about 1 in 10 countries. Many of those processes collapse, many of them stall or go on for many years, and some of them will result in constitutional change. But this constant activity of constitutional change is becoming more and more frequent, and therefore the demand for constitutional advice is seemingly never ending. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is something we will come to a bit later on. The other trend that I wanted to mention, which I think was highlighted in Karsten's talk, is that let me give a couple of stories. So in Mali, when they were drafting their constitution in 1992, there was a Canadian electoral expert. And he writes about his experience there, and he said, they asked me for constitutional advice just because I happened to be in Mali. In Czechoslovakia, which is where my wife's mother is from, there was such a thing called the American Committee for Constitutional Scholarship or something like this. And it was nothing more than a group of Americans who'd been put together by one American professor who happened to have been on holiday at the time of the revolution. And he turned up to the offices of the Civic Forum, the opposition that sort of led the Velvet Revolution, and said, I'm a constitutional lawyer, can I help? And this kind of activity in terms of constitutional advice was very ad hoc. Nika and I know well Yashpal Ghai from Kenya, who's sort of the father of constitutional advice, I should say. And, you know, when I hear him telling stories, it was just basically Yash running around the world from Pacific Island to Pacific Island, going to provide advice. And that kind of sort of ad hoc advice is changed into something much more institutionalized. And so now constitutional advice is rarely provided by individuals if they are not attached to some institution. So someone might bring in Nico, someone might bring in Yash, but those institutions are the ones providing advice, whether that be the United Nations, the Venice Commission, International IDEA, or others. And what that does is it brings with it a series of constraints, right? So no longer is Yash providing advice based on what he thinks is best for the country, but advice is shaped by the constraints that organization faces. So to give a couple of examples, the Venice Commission, hugely successful and impressive in its work over the last 30 years, it provides advice based on what it calls the European constitutional heritage. So it looks at European constitutional systems and it sort of takes from their norms and standards that then it provides advice for other countries that are drafting new constitutions. And so I'm not sure that they would look at it this way, but I look at it as a constraint, because in any country where they're working, it's not really their methodology to say, here's what we think is best for Syria. It is their methodology to say, here's what you've done, and here's how it compares to European standards. And why that's important is that I'm not sure it's always clear to the beneficiaries that this is what they're not being told, this is the best constitution for your country. They're being told, this is how it compares to what we think are European standards, which is fine when you're talking about countries that are looking to join the European Union, because they've already made the decision. We want to be part of this club. We want to have European standards. Show us how we get these European standards into our constitution. But the Venice Commission now provides advice on Venezuela, on Kyrgyzstan, on Tunisia, that perhaps shouldn't be facing the same kinds of standards and constraints. Intergovernmental organizations face other kinds of constraints, and Karsten, I think, has spoken at length and in depth about the issues of Security Council mandates, which limit what the UN can do. As you all know, the UN's mandate in terms of the Constitutional Committee is convening and facilitating. So I don't, when Noel said, well, the special envoy sits there and listens, I'm not sure he can do much more under his mandate, right? So that mandate constrains the political mission of the United Nations, and the Security Council debates, as we know, are constrained in turn by the political will of the states that are involved in the Security Council. I think NGOs may be a little bit freer, but for any of us that have ever worked in a project environment, you face other types of constraints. You've promised your donor 6 workshops this year. The donor wants to see outputs. The donor wants to see impact. There's nothing worse for showing impact than constitutional processes. It takes a long time, and there's only one output that anyone cares about, but donors want to see, right? And so we had a recent example in South Sudan where I think we have to pull out, because what the donor wants us to do in terms of just these endless workshops and trainings, we think is actually counterproductive to the politics of the situation. So the institutionalization of constitutional assistance has brought with it constraints. That may be, and I'm not saying that's either good or bad, but what I wish is that those constraints would be clearer when people are providing advice. This is what we're doing under these constraints that we're facing, and I think, as I said, Karsten did an excellent job of illustrating that in the case of the Syrian Constitutional Committee. Another couple of trends that I would mention in terms of international assistance is that, for the most part, as far as I know, internationals are no longer drafting constitutions for other countries. I think there's a level now of awareness of the importance of national ownership, that the nationals would not stand for it, and the internationals would not seek to do it, because most internationals who've done this for any amount of time would know that that's a very bad idea. So international assistance takes place in other kinds of ways. I don't think that I've seen many places where in the Constitutional Committee, in the Constitutional Assembly, internationals are intervening, and I think that's a good thing. I think that the Assembly or the Constitutional Committee should be Syrians talking to Syrians, whichever country you're dealing with. But what I do see in a lot of other places is many more workshops like this one, where you're working with the Syrians are talking to each other, but with international facilitation, a session on presidential systems, a session on system of government, a session on federalism. In nearly every process I've been involved in, you have this hive of activity outside the Constitutional Committee, which is where a lot of the knowledge transfer and discussion takes place. In the actual building, people are grandstanding, they're talking to their constituents, they're not really trying to reason through the issues as they are in some of these other places. And the other trend that I think is important is that international assistance now is at least as focused on the process of constitution making as on the design of the constitution itself. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, process of constitution making wasn't really a thing. I mean, from the 1780s, when you had 55 Americans going into one room for a few weeks and they came out with a constitution, that was pretty much the model for a long time. It's just that it happened a lot in London instead of your own country in the case of the UK colonies. So you would send off a bunch of experts, they'd come out with a constitution. Now we think that it's a good idea to have more process, that brings in more people, that you consult with the people, that you might take care in how you select the constitution making body. And there, for good or for bad, has become an area where internationals seek a lot of influence, and they seem to have more influence in terms of process, I would say, than on the design of the Constitution. So, moving on from this sort of historical perspective to the second part of my talk, there are two things that sort of annoy me endlessly when it comes to constitution making. One is, annoy is the wrong word, but one is that there should be no international assistance because this is a national process. And I'm going to talk about that in the third section of my talk. What does it mean to say national ownership? But the other part that I would like to talk about here in the second section of my talk is this idea that constitutional assistance is legal, that it's technical, and that it's not political. And so in terms of talking about the politics of constitution making, I'll divide this part into sort of two sections. First, I want to talk about a framework for what we call the forces and mechanisms of constitution making. So this is quite a well-known academic paper from 1995, so a long time ago now. But to me, it's still the best framework that applies generally to constitution making and the politics of constitution making. And then I want to talk about how international assistance fits into that. And if you promise not to tell anyone outside this room, I'll tell you some terrible stories of mistakes I've made along the way in learning about the harsh politics of constitution making. So what Elster, this academic, says is when we think about a constitution making body, one mistake is to think that it has constituent power, that it is completely sovereign, that it has no constraints on it whatsoever. He says, firstly, there's two very important constraints when we think about the constitution-making body and what it can produce. The first one is what he calls upstream constraints. Those are constraints that take place before the constitution-making body is established. And generally that involves who selects who's going to sit on the body and what is their mandate. Right? So how that constitution-making body is formed, and clearly in the case of the Syrian Constitutional Committee, this was a very is a very contentious issue in terms of who's there, who's not there, and how many seats you get. That's going to shape what the constitution looks like. If your group is not represented on the body, they're not going to be able to vote for their interests. If your group has a majority, a constitution-making majority, they're not going to want to negotiate with other people on the body. And the other thing is mandate. Nico's worked a lot in Sri Lanka, and I remember in the last failed Sri Lankan process, you had, in Sri Lanka you have a linguistic minority called the Tamils, right? And the Tamils want federalism or something like it. And so the Tamil party that was being elected to parliament, that was going to negotiate the constitution, they said, we'll negotiate for federalism. But then you had a Sinhala party, which is the ethnic majority, and they said, we will not allow federalism. And then they were elected. And so then they come together in this parliament and they both have mandates which constrain them. And it's very difficult for them to then negotiate because they've made commitments to their constituents. So these types of upstream constraints, what does the body look like, who's on it, and what are their orders, what is their mandate, are very important in terms of thinking about the constitution-making body. If you want to change the way the constitution-making body is working, or you want to change the way the constitution-making body is the direction it's heading, you have to think about these upstream constraints before, much earlier in the process. And then there's downstream constraints, and most often this is in the case of a referendum. In the case of the Constitutional Committee, I think it's left to be determined how whatever draft would be adopted. But that's a very important thing. I mean, in the case of a referendum in Kenya, for example, I remember that in the negotiations, they didn't know if the draft was going to pass at referendum. They needed 50%. And so they started to think about, well, we have a draft here. What do we need to take out, or what do we need to add in order to get it to pass at referendum? And they added a teacher service commission, because the teachers' union was a very strong lobby. If the teachers' union would support the constitution draft, that would bring a lot of votes at referendum. And they took out guarantees for sexual orientation minorities. So that there was something, I'm not sure if it ever got put in there, but there was a big lobby for same-sex marriage, gay marriage, but there was an even bigger lobby against same-sex marriage. And they thought, if we put this in for same-sex marriage, it's going to kill the draft of referendum. So the referendum was a downstream constraint. While drafting the constitution, they were not free to think about whatever constitution they wanted to draft. They have to think about what's coming after the constitution making body finishes its work. So that happens before and after the constitution making body does its work. In the constitution making body, how are decisions made? How does the arguing and bargaining process take place? So Elster says that one thing that people do in a constitution making body is they bargain. You want a strong president at the center, fine, but you give us more regional autonomy. You want to have a bicameral system, fine, but we're going to make sure the lower house is more powerful than the second house. These kinds of trade-offs are bargains that are made in constitution making all the time. And then there's arguing, which having attended the sixth constitutional committee, I know that there was a lot of arguing that you're familiar with. And arguing, he says, takes place based on three sort of drivers of the arguments. One is passion. Sometimes it's just something you feel very passionate about. Often, especially when we think about ethnic groups or marginalized groups, they're arguing based on passion, on their lived realities of oppression. Another one is reason. Sometimes people are just saying, this is a better idea, this is a better system for our country. And the other one is interest. And that could be personal interest. So for example, in Myanmar, that a couple of people here are familiar with, there was an Article 59F of the Constitution which prevented Aung San Suu Kyi from ever becoming president. So she would have a personal interest in changing that article of the Constitution. Group interest we see quite commonly, which is often results in calls for group autonomy or better representation for particular groups, whether that be ascriptive groups like ethnic groups or religious groups, or also women. And institutional interests. Sometimes institutions have their own will. I was recently involved in Haiti, and the Constitutional Commission there wanted to get rid of the Senate, wanted to go from a two-chamber bicameral system to one chamber. And they were unable to get this done and ended up having to put back in the Senate because the senators didn't want to lose their job. And so the senators, despite the fact they were from different parties, were very clear that the Senate must survive because we need to get paid. And this happens quite a lot where institutions are sticky. It's very hard to get rid of institutions once you have them. And most strikingly in the case of directly elected presidents. So I think there's been by now almost 2,000 cases of constitutional change around the world, new constitutions, in the last 200 or so years. And I think there's only been about 5 or 6 cases where you've had a directly elected president and you've gone to a parliamentary system. Once you have it, but in many cases you've gone the other way, like in Syria, like in many British colonies that started off with a parliamentary system like the UK, but then decided they wanted to have a directly elected president. But very rarely, history shows us, do you go from a directly elected president to an indirectly elected chief executive. And so how does international assistance fit into this? I think this is probably where I've really learned the most in terms of my own work and just running around the world and talking to people in constitution making. The first clear example is in upstream constraints, especially in post-conflict situations, because how the constitution making body is going to be designed is often comes out of mediated peace talks or mediated political settlements, right? So the 150 members, the small body, the 50-50-50, middle third, all of this was decided in a mediated political agreement. And so the internationals, I think, sometimes they don't bring in constitutional expertise at that stage. They just want peace, or they just want a political deal. Fine, let's put all of this stuff in, but they're not thinking enough about the implications down the road. Peace agreements not only provide procedural constraints, but sometimes often substantive constraints. So in the South Sudan peace agreement, it commits that there says there will be a South Sudanese constitution which will establish a federal republic. So at the peace agreement, they've already decided that South Sudan will be a federation. In the Algiers peace accord for Mali, there's a whole raft of provisions that would require constitutional change in terms of representation for a group in the north. And the other sort of challenge or problem in this is not only do you not have enough constitutional expertise from the international community side at that level, but clearly from the national side, these are constitutional issues. Peace agreements might be negotiated in the names of the conflict parties, but constitutions should be drafted in the name of we the people, right? And so peace agreements, although they're limited normally to a group of men who are negotiating the end of the peace, but because of these upstream constraints, they actually then prevent people from deciding freely on what their own constitutional framework will look like. So internationalists, I think, should think a lot more at that level, the peace mediation level, about the upstream constraints they're putting on the constitutional process. Downstream constraints, internationals have less of a formal role. There were cases like in Kosovo where the international representative actually had a veto over the constitution. This, of course, is very rare. But certainly in the case of the Venice Commission, what normally happens is a country will produce a draft, send it to the Venice Commission, almost like a constitutional court, and say, can you approve this? And previously, there is, in many countries, there's some level of, we want a constitution that looks like other constitutions, that has a Bill of Rights, that has these things that Western countries seem to have, because that will provide some form of legitimacy. If we have a very, when I go to places and we talk about constitutional ideas, they often want to know, well, where else has this? People are very scared to say, well, let's put this in our constitution, even if no one else has done it. There's some form of international legitimacy that comes from just your constitution looking like other constitutions. And there's very good studies about the Pacific Islands when they were becoming independent. They were quite explicit about what they wanted was independence. They didn't really care about what their constitution looked like. So they said, well, let's have a constitution that looks like the UK constitution, because that way when the UN sees it, they'll know that it's a constitution for a state, and so they're more likely to give us the statehood that we want. So that's another sort of form of legitimacy as a downstream constraint that the internationals may donate to a process. In terms of the arguing and the bargaining, this is where I think international assistance can be slightly dangerous sometimes. So I remember being in Chile, and we had a session on the process with the government that was designing the constitutional process. And I thought I was being a very neutral international civil servant. I was just giving options. Option 1, option 2, I think we went through 4 options. We all went for dinner, and they sat at dinner talking amongst these 4 options about which one would give their party, their president, the most partisan benefit, right? So you come in as a neutral, apartisan advisor, they take that advice and they use it for political gain. Even at the moment in the Chile Convention, they are inviting people to give expert testimony. But it's really like a US congressional hearing. You're not really, I don't think, helping them reason through constitutional issues. What you're doing is you're giving one side or the other leverage. So you see, international expert Eva Maria Belsa agreed with me. And they're just using that international advice as political leverage within the constitution-making body. I mean, I remember in Myanmar, there was a constitutional lawyer for the NLD, who was the opposition at the time, and he asked a few of us, do you think our constitution is the hardest to amend in the world? They really wanted to change the amendment procedure to make it easier to change. And I normally, when I'm faced with questions like that, respond with a question. But there was another gentleman in the room, good person. He said, yeah, I have to say, I think it is the most difficult to amend in the world. The next day in the newspaper, the same constitutional lawyer went and said, international expert X agrees that Myanmar constitution is the most difficult to amend in the world. And so I think you always have to be very careful, especially for the United Nations, I think, but also for other international advisors who seek to be non-partisan, to be aware of how any explicit position you take on a contentious issue is going to be used politically. So basically what our arguments that the political stakeholders see as based on interest, you think you're giving them ideas based on reason, but they are using those reasoned arguments, or they're taking the arguments they want to promote their own interest, they're shrouding it in these public interest arguments that you're giving them. What else to say about arguing and bargaining? Yeah, I mean, maybe on the politics of it, I think maybe I'll just end there and just say that, my point is just that all advice is political. This workshop is political. There will be people who could use this workshop for political gain, right? So no matter where we are, what we're doing, I think just to be aware of the political implications of how this is going to pan out in a constitution-making process is very important. In terms of the third part of my talk, principles for effective assistance, in 2021, January 2021, a year ago, the UN released Secretary General's guidance note for constitutional assistance. And this was supposed to provide guidance on whenever the UN is providing constitutional assistance. And there are 6 principles there. I shall read them. Foster peace building and sustainable human development, ensure national ownership and reflect local context, promote international norms and standards, support inclusivity, participation, and transparency, mobilize and convene a wide range of expertise, and promote effective implementation. Like anything, as Karsten will know, that goes through so many levels of UN clearance, these kinds of notes end up getting watered down to the point where I don't think anyone who picked up that document would say, oh, thank you for this guidance, now I know what to do. It is the nature of the beast that once it goes through all these UN departments and the UN legal office, the language ceases to really mean anything. So what I wanted to do was write something which might actually be a little bit helpful. And so, especially in the mediation context. And so the UN already has at the mediation unit these principles for effective mediation, which are preparation, consent, impartiality, inclusivity, national ownership, coherence and complementarity, and quality peace agreements. These are their principles for effective mediation. And I thought, many of these apply to constitutional assistance. And so I started to write about what I think constitutional advisors should think about and how I think national stakeholders should hold those advisors to account. So I won't talk about all of these, but I talk about some of them that I think are most relevant for Syria. The first one is preparedness. And my rule for my staff, if you're going to a country to provide constitutional advice, I have this sort of rule of thumb that we call 6 books. So it's like you have to read at least 6 books about that country before you get on a plane. A constitutional history, a political history, an assessment of the conflict, if it's a post-conflict country, a classic from their literature, what are people reading now? You have to understand a little bit in order to be able to not only connect with people, but don't ask stupid questions. When you get there. I remember being very young, an organization called IDLO, and I was in Afghanistan. We met with the Attorney General, and my boss is a lovely guy, but he asked the Attorney General things like, do you already have a code of criminal procedure? I said, but these are things you can find out on the internet. We've got 1 hour with the Attorney General. He's the Attorney General. He's an important guy. Why are you asking him these inane questions? So do the preparation, but clearly, no matter how many briefings you receive, no matter how many books you read, the experts are always going to be the locals. You're the ones who lived through the previous constitution, the current constitution. I never voted in any of the countries I worked in. I never went to court in any of the countries I worked in. I never felt the constitution of these countries, but the national stakeholders have. So as much as possible, it's also very important early on to speak to civil society activists, academics, as well as, of course, the government partners. And I would really, like to see more national stakeholders sort of hold, when internationals come and ask stupid questions about your constitution, just say, it's on the internet. Read the constitution, understand it before you come and try to provide us with advice. The second issue is consent, and clearly this is a very delicate issue in terms of the Constitutional Committee. And so now I think it's a fair and an uncontroversial thing to say that you can't really provide advice without the consent of the people who are asking for that advice. But as I'll discuss when it comes to national ownership, whose consent is a very important thing, and how consent is maintained throughout the process is also a very difficult thing. And having worked at the UN and been with the Office of the Special Envoy, I feel like a lot of his job is maintaining consent. It's not once he's got his mandate, he can then run off with it, but he's got to be in a continuous process of relationship management with the Syrian parties, with the non-Syrian parties, to maintain their consent. And also what I've learned from the international perspective is consent can be partial. It may start with often, they may want money. They say, we need money to conduct public consultations. We need money to pay the people on the Constitutional Commission. And I used to say, well, I'm not sure that's a good thing. If you can't pay for your own constitutional process, what are you paying for? This is your constitution. But I do now think there are lots of organizations with money. International IDEA is not one of them, unfortunately. But start with what you can start with and build off that consent rather than asking for the moon straight away. Impartiality is another principle, and it arises in different forms. So one is, especially for intergovernmental organizations, we're not supposed to be partisan towards a particular group. I think NGOs can be, and that can be very useful. But certainly at International IDEA and definitely the UN, you can't really just pick sides, right? That doesn't mean necessarily being neutral, especially when it comes to universal norms or values. I think also the UN does and should advocate for inclusivity in terms of getting people to the table. But once those people are at the table, the UN should avoid advocating explicitly for their positions of one side or the other. And that goes back a bit to what I said about the Myanmar example of being very careful that not only are you not partisan, but you avoid the perception of being partisan by taking particular positions on the constitution. There's another impartiality issue, which maybe more accurately is called one of bias, which I'm certainly guilty of. I'm a British, Indian, American trained lawyer. That adds up to one thing. I'm a very Anglophone common lawyer. Right? I try to understand Francophone systems. I read French, I speak French, but I get lost. And when you find something very strange and very confusing, it's very hard to provide advice on it. And so I do think that we all have biases. We've all grown up with particular constitutional systems. We're all more familiar with some systems than others. And it's very hard to maintain that consciousness of your own biases. And I think that, for example, when the UN is putting together a team of constitutional experts, they should be very conscious of, let's try and get a balance between civil and common lawyers, or people from the region, but people also from outside the region, because you do want a balance between people that are, you may go to I should give the example of Tunisia. So in Tunisia's constitution, Article 60 says that the chair of the finance committee in parliament will be the leader of the opposition. It's a nice article. I like it because it gives, after Ben Ali, the constitution is saying there is an opposition because we've given him a job right here. And there are other articles right there that say, for example, committees in parliament should be based on proportionality of parties. That idea of the chair of the finance committee being the leader of the opposition goes back to Prime Minister Gladstone in the UK. And it became a sort of thing in UK-influenced constitutions, and then it bled into the Francophone world. So I don't think that these two worlds should never talk, but it's good to have people that understand what you're talking about when you're in a Francophone system or continental system, but also you understand, but you have people from outside that system. And Syria is sort of very interesting because you have influences, I think, from both worlds in your constitutional history. So it's important you have people that understand both worlds who are advising you. So that's on impartiality. On inclusivity, I remember speaking to a human rights activist from Grenada, and he was from a marginalized group that hadn't had any say in politics for a long time. And he said, the best thing you can do is get us to the table. Then let me make my argument. And if they're not ready to accept my argument, then that's fine. But if you force my argument on them, they'll never accept it. And they'll never implement it. So the job of the UN, the job of the international community should be to get people to the table, get their voices heard. But I think we're starting to think more about inclusivity. It used to be just about numbers at the table. But I think we should think about inclusivity both in terms of depth and breadth, you could say. So depth means not just people at the table, but who's chairing these meetings, who's heading the committees. You often see, for example, international community insists on 30% of women in a particular constitution-making body. So you get 30% of women, and they all end up on the Children's Committee, on the Gender Committee, on the Leisure and Culture Committee, but all the big committee, the Federalism Committee, the System of Government Committee, it's all men, right? So it's not just about getting women into the room, but also making sure that they and other groups have positions of leadership. But also it's about breadth of participation. And I think the WAB is a good example of, it's not just about who's in the room, but how do you get the voices of people who are not in the room to influence what's happening in these negotiations. And I think there's a lot that could be done. An interesting example was from Kenya, where they had a committee of experts that was going around the country consulting people, producing a draft and giving it to Parliament. That was the process. But they also established this thing which, I don't know, sort of a mix between the WAB and the Civil Society Support Room. It was called a reference group, and it was 30 civil society organizations. And their job, whenever the committee of experts was really stuck on an issue, there was deadlock, they could consult this reference group, which sort of would provide a public voice, a civil society voice. So inclusion is not just inside the room, getting people into the room, but also what positions do they have in the room, and how do we get voices from outside of the room to be influential. A particularly thorny issue when it comes to inclusion is the one of spoilers. And tomorrow I know Nico's going to be talking about Somalia, and I suppose the very basic thing is that, as much as possible, I think you've got to make every effort possible to involve everyone. Better to have them inside the tent than outside. And, well, maybe we can get into this a bit with Somalia. I think, Al-Shabaab was not involved in the 2012 constitution process. That the Minister of Constitutional Affairs had his own strategy, which Nico might talk about tomorrow. We can certainly discuss, but certainly what to do with spoilers who question the very legitimacy of the process and refuse to accept it is a very difficult issue for internationals. I've got 2 or 3 more things to say on these principles, and one is on coordination and coherence. Internationals are really bad at this, I think. Internationals compete for money, they compete for face time with the national counterparts, and often that means that they don't play nicely with each other and they become very territorial, and that's not a good thing. The UN is in a good place, I think, to play a role as coordinator of international assistance. It has universal membership, but also it's not just involved in the constitution or rule of law or political affairs. It sees the whole world. It sees humanitarian issues. It sees education. The UN sees women's issues. UN, through its all different agencies, has a much more global view of what's happening in the countries. I think the UN is in a good role and should be coordinating international assistance. The problem is often it takes the role of coordinator and changes it into the role of gatekeeper and doesn't allow other people to sort of add to the process and doesn't take advantage of what other organizations can do. And this morning we heard, with Karsten saying, well, in a lot of places, track 1 takes advantage of track 2. And uses track 2. And we've worked with the UN as a track 2 organization in Yemen where they were pushing us. We need you to do this. We need you to do more of this. But in other cases, for whatever reason, the UN feels it needs to distance itself from track 2. Coming to the issue of national ownership, well, one more thing on coordination is coherence of international advice. And this, we've recently had some arguments about in relation to Sudan. Should international advice differ? Right? Is it helpful for national stakeholders to get more than one opinion from internationals and say, well, the European Centre for Kurdish Studies told us this was a good idea, an international idea told us that was a good idea, and the UN told us this other thing was a good idea? Or is it good for national stakeholders to get the same advice? And my own view on this is that it's very important for internationals to talk to each other. And then if the European Centre has a different idea from international idea, then at least we understand where we're coming from, and you provide your advice and we'll provide our advice and we go forward. There's no obligation that we all need to agree. These are difficult issues. No one has the right answer. But what often happens is you find out after the fact that you've been advocating for a lighter process and you don't think that they should have all these conferences and a referendum, and some other organization has been advocating for a very heavy process and all these things. And I don't think that's helpful when the internationals we don't need to sing from the same hymn sheet, but at least we need to know what songs the other internationals are singing. On the issue of national ownership, again, I think it's a more prickly issue than people often think. So now that no one's writing constitutions for other countries, everyone thinks, okay, well, we're just providing assistance, they're the decision makers, and so that's national ownership. And firstly, I mean, there's two things that sort of keep me up at night about this thing. One is, who are the national owners? Right? Like, for an intergovernmental organization, for example, we cannot work as International IDEA in any country without working with the government. We can work with other people, we can work with the opposition, we can work with civil society, but it would be impossible for us to go into a country and ignore the government, especially a government of a member state. The problem with the UN is they're all member states. And so, but there are other organizations, NGOs, that don't have that problem. So they can work with other people. So, but, it's a very difficult issue when you're working in a country which has an authoritarian government to say, well, and they claim national ownership. So they say, well, we're the government of the country, we should be the ones deciding. International IDEA has the luxury of choice. So I remember Côte d'Ivoire 2016, they asked us to come and look at their draft constitution and provide advice on gender issues. And I felt that we were being used to legitimize their process. They didn't want us to touch the institutions relating to political power, which were strengthening the office of the president. And so we didn't. But the UN doesn't have that choice. If a member state says, can you come and provide us with assistance, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the UN to say no. And also on national ownership, I mean, I think this is another thing we do badly, or I do badly, which is that even sometimes the way we frame issues, the words we use, they take some agency away from the national stakeholders. And I give you an example of Nepal, where, Nico and Soren may have differing opinions, but I feel like that the idea of federalism, which was ultimately the big constitutional bargain, they wanted a federal Nepal. I went to Nepal in 2015. They'd been talking about federalism for 7 years, and honestly, none of them understood what federalism was. There was no word in Nepali before the internationals got there for federalism. So they had to call it federalism or something, they sort of added a Nepali accent and or came up with another word or something. But I feel that the mistakes were made in terms of, rather than talking about what are the issues that you have in your life, do you want to be able to choose your own children's school curriculum in your communities? Or do you think it's a good idea to have that done at the national level and have standards across the country? You care about your own language. Well, do you care what language is used at the national parliament? Or do you only care what languages your children are educated in? And I think that often we as internationals, political scientists, constitutional lawyers, we have these terms in our head. And we sometimes push them on people before they're ready for them. And then they become very attached to them as sort of political banners. We want federalism. I'm not sure. I know the political elites in the Madhesi wanted federalism. I'm not sure the Madhesi citizens wanted anything more than just, more access to resources or something like that, right? So, so that's one issue that I find very difficult sometimes. In South Sudan, they talked about federalism, and there was a Bari, one of the main ethnic languages, word that they invented for it, which was Kokora, and this was in the 1980s. But Kokora actually means division. Federalism means pact, right? It means deal between, and so they'd basically taken the word federalism, tried to come up with a new word for it. Their word meant almost the opposite. And so I think rather than talking about these, and then the first president of South Sudan said something, I think, very wise. He said, it may be a federation, it may be not a federation. First, let the baby be born. Let the constitution be done. Then we'll let the political scientists figure out what to call it. And so I really like those words, and let's just figure out what these provisions look like Because and I don't mean to pick on federalism. This could be any term. But what we do is, what we do then is we say, well, federalism has these 5 components according to Ronald Watts or George Anderson or whatever, and it has shared rule at the center and this, that. And then people sort of check their constitution against that model of federalism. And I think trying to move away from those models is difficult for us, because sometimes you need to be able to organize your presentation on what you're talking about, and you do that in ways that are familiar to you. That's certainly something I could do better. Let's see. Yeah, the very last thing I would say about constitutional change is that it's become a bit of an industry, the international assistance to constitution building. I'm going to have to remind myself to close with some words about why international assistance is a good thing, because I feel like I'm arguing myself out of a job. But it is becoming a bit of an industry, right? Before 10, 15 years ago, there was no international idea program on constitution building. Now we have a whole program. We have 7 staff. All we do is constitution building. We have people in all the regions. UNDPPA did not have a constitutions advisor full-time. UNDP did not have a constitutions advisor full-time. Lots of other organizations pick up constitution making when it comes into their sort of field of interest or country of interest. And so I think sometimes one thing that I'm learning is that we should stop ourselves and also ask the national stakeholders and really ask sometimes, is the Constitution the solution to these problems? Or is it not? I mean, Karsten told us today, it doesn't matter what you do on the provisions of the government. If you don't change the way that power is exercised, then nothing is going to change. And we see that quite a lot. And so sometimes, going back to Haiti, which is a country I was working on last year, the special envoy, special envoy told me, we have this big problem around the referendum for the Constitution because the gangs are threatening to burn down all the polling stations. And I said, if your problem is gangs burning down the polling stations, the Constitution is not going to fix that. These problems are beyond the Constitution. And so don't think that just because you're going to try and push this Constitution through somehow, it's going to fix this complete control that gangs have over Haitian life. So sometimes, even though it's counterintuitive for us, I'm trying to really question people and say, do you want us here? Do you really want a new Constitution? Botswana right now wants a new constitution, one of the most successful democracies in Africa. And I can't get a good answer from anyone I speak to in Botswana about why. It just seems, they say, well, this is our independence constitution, and it was never really owned by Botswanans. We just sort of inherited it with decolonization. But it's working. You don't have war, you have economic development, you have growth, you have... they say, yeah, but it doesn't have all these other things that these modern constitutions do, like the South African, all these nice socioeconomic rights that the South African constitution does. And so, but I think that, there's 2 dangers there. One is that expectations often become far out of whack with reality. People think that, there's something magical about a constitution. That's why I like to work in it. It's beyond, I used to just do rule of law work, which was training for lawyers and judges and legal aid. Constitution is beyond the law. It's in the political sphere, it's in the social sphere. It talks about who we are as people. It defines the political community, our values, why we belong together. So there's something very magical and attractive about a constitution. But sometimes it promises more than it can deliver constitutional change. And people do often get involved in these processes of constitutional reform with unreal expectations. And I think that's why now some authoritarians are using constitutional reform to calm protests. Okay, we'll look at the Constitution. Let's set up a commission. We'll take 2 years and we'll think about the Constitution. And people, yeah, that's what we want, a new Constitution, just like South Africa. But it doesn't really go anywhere. And the second thing is sometimes it causes a lot of conflict. Again, now I'm picked on federalism, now I'm going to pick on South Africa and Nico. So South Africa inspired a lot of people around the world. And people wanted to do things just like South Africa because it was such a miracle of democracy and human rights. And in South Africa, what they did was they started to talk about principles, right? 34 principles they came up with, which was going to be the basis for the new constitution and the new South Africa. And these were really principles about who we are as South Africans, what does it mean to be a South African. And I remember being in Ukraine, And following the revolution, they wanted to change the system of government. They wanted a less strong president and a more strong parliament. And so there was one organization that came in and said, let's do consultation and let's talk about what it means to be a Ukrainian, and we'll talk about all these values of Ukraine and everything else. And I said, do you know what? Sometimes I go home for Christmas, and if we had to every Christmas talk about our values as a family, I would just fight with my mom and dad all Christmas dinner. Sometimes talking about these things can be more divisive than it can be uniting. Sometimes you just leave them. Let's just fix the provisions on the government and not get through this whole like South African process of let's talk about our values and common principles, because sometimes it can create more conflict. Lastly, let me actually say a word. So what is the point in external constitutional assistance? And I think there's a few. One is that when people are, especially in post-conflict contexts, when people are arguing about their interests in the constitution, they often come into deadlock. You want a presidential system, I want a parliamentary system. You want a unitary system, I want a federal system, whatever it may be. And I think what external constitutional advisors can do is what Fink Haysom, UN Special Envoy and South African advisor to Mandela, he calls it expanding the constitutional imagination. And so if you want option A and I want option B, maybe an advisor can come and put option C, D, and E on the table. And it increases the chances of us getting to consensus, right? So I find that a lot of our work is really just helping people think about options that they didn't think existed. And another thing is just being a sounding board most of the time, right? So, I mean, I'm very lucky that I get to go around and talk to constitution makers all the time. And I just hear stories. And so then, if someone what am I doing next week? If someone in Armenia has a question, I might respond with a story or a question from Ukraine or from Belarus. And it's not so much me giving them advice and saying, here's what I think you should put in your constitution. I can't imagine anything worse. But it's more, I think, international advisors, especially those that are like Nico, who've been around to many processes, they're wise enough to have heard a lot of stories and been through a lot of lessons learned. They're also wise enough to know we have very limited influence. We're not there to save these countries. This isn't some sort of colonial project where we go and we say, we have the answers because we come from the UN or we come from the West. One useful thing we can do, I think, is share a lot of other experiences, because we're the ones lucky enough to be flown around and talk to other processes, whereas a lot of the time the national stakeholders are very unaware of what's been done in other countries. And then it's their job to adapt, not to adopt those experiences to their own context, because they're the ones that know their own context better. So I don't know if that's an hour, but my voice is starting to fade on me, so I think I'll close there.
It's even more than an hour.
Oh, was it really? My
we
goodness.
started
You should have stopped me. You should have stopped me.
You want to conclude, you done?
Yes, please. Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sumit. That was absolutely inspiring. Thanks a lot. We'll go for a coffee break, half an hour. So we are back again at 4:45 for Q&A and discussion.
Great. Look forward
Thank
to
you.
it.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very rich.
A bit rambling,
Your
I
wife
find
is
sometimes.
definitely right. You can talk for an hour, you can talk for 2 or 3 hours. It's not a problem.